Sweet. All right. Well, thank you all for joining. I'm happy here to have Celeste Headlee. Celeste has been a journalist since 1999. She's worked as a reporter, producer, and host in public radio on the local, national, and international level. She started her broadcasting career at Arizona Public Radio in Flagstaff, then moved to WDET in Detroit before taking a job with NPR. She's also a TED speaker, and she wrote this excellent book called We Need to Talk. It's really awesome, and she's going to share some tips on conversation and what we could do to become better in conversation. So without much further ado, let's welcome Celeste.
Most of us have a pretty hard time accepting that we're not great conversationalists. Generally, we seem to think when a conversation goes bad, we blame the other person. And in fact, that's not just my opinion. There's a lot of really good research that shows that we actually rate our conversational skills much higher than they actually are, just in general. And there's two things going on there. The first is the smarter you are, the harder it is for you to be good in conversation. Being smart in general is actually pretty helpful. Logic has probably helped you solve a lot of problems in your life. But they don't help you when you're talking to another human being. And that's because human beings, even you, are inherently emotional and illogical. Reason is not, our logical skills are not why we have succeeded on the planet. It wasn't our logic and our reason. Actually, it was our soft skills and our hive mind. So emotion isn't actually a weakness, even though we think of it that way, and we try to punish other people when they bring emotion to a conversation, right? So the problem is that you can't just rely on your IQ. An EQ is almost more important in a conversation than an IQ is. You can't even trust your own logic when you're in a conversation. You can't even trust your own logic when you're solving a logical problem, let alone an emotional problem. And I say that because if you look at the work of, say, Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman, and he was the one that said that very often we rely on system one thinking. So what is system one thinking? It's really, really useful, right? So you're getting out of the subway and you see a really disheveled, dirty, kind of smelly guy, and he's sitting on a piece of cardboard on the ground, and you say that's a homeless guy, right? That's system one thinking. You're making an assumption about that. And we do it all the time. And it helps us, because if we actually had to reason through every single thing that we encountered in daily life, we would get stuck. We'd never get through anything. The problem is that system one thinking is really easily diluted. And we make assumptions all the time in conversations, right? We assume we know what someone's about to say, so we interrupt them. We assume we know what they mean, so then we come up with our response before they've even finished their sentence. So system one thinking is not always wrong, it's just often wrong. And one of the ways that Kahneman, who I again want to emphasize is a psychologist, not a mathematician, one of the ways he demonstrated this was by presenting these really simple math problems to students at MIT and Princeton and Harvard. So for example, he would say a baseball and a bat together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball does. How much does the ball cost? And most of the students said the ball costs 10 cents. But the bat costs $1 more than the ball does, which means the ball is actually 5 cents. And the baseball bat is $1.05. And it's the same thing. He had another problem where he said, what was it? There's a patch of lily pads on a lake, and every day the patch doubles in size. It takes 48 days for the lily pads to completely cover the lake. How long does it take for the lily pads to cover half the lake? Well, most people just divide it in half, right? And they say 24. But it takes 47 days, because if it doubles in size, then the day before it covered the whole lake, it covered half the lake. See, system one thinking is even going to steer you wrong when you're dealing with math problems. So you can imagine how much it gets screwed up when you're dealing with me, who's full of emotion and memory and illogical decisions. There's another little wrinkle to this. And you may have heard a little bit about this, but I'll tell you the story of Justin Kruger and David Dunning, knowing perfectly well you've probably Googled this before. But back in 1999, they were trying to figure out how to train people, how to train them more efficiently. So they tested hundreds, if not thousands, of people. And what they did was they gave them tests, And after they'd taken the test, they would say, okay, rate how well you think you did on the test. How many problems do you think you got wrong? And then rate how well you think you did in comparison with other people, right? And what they discovered was the more ignorant you are on a subject, the more likely you are to think that you're above average. The exact same competence that's needed to have knowledge of a subject is what is needed to actually evaluate competence. If you're incompetent in physics, you don't know if a physics problem is hard or easy. If you're a novice in tennis, you don't know if a play that Serena Williams just executed is difficult or not, right? If you know nothing about wine, you'll taste the wine and you'll be like, this is delicious, but you actually don't have any idea. And it goes the other way also, except there's a wrinkle when you are competent. The people who did really well on the test consistently underestimated how well they did. And it wasn't that they didn't know what they got wrong or got right. They were actually pretty accurate in knowing what they got wrong or what they got right. Where it went wonky was when they compared themselves to other people, because they assumed everyone was competent. So they, in comparison with others, underrated themselves, thinking that everyone basically shared the base level of competence. Okay, so why am I telling you this? It's because 99 times out of 100, when people ask me about conversation, it's about how to change someone else's behavior. It's about how to stop somebody else from interrupting you, or how to stop somebody from running on and on and on and on and boring you to death, or how to get out of a conversation you don't want to be in, blah, blah, blah. And there's good news and the bad news on this. And the bad news is you can't. You cannot change someone else's behavior. The good news is you can change your own, and there's probably room for improvement. The other step of good news there is that modeling behavior is really strong among human beings. If you model good conversational etiquette, it's really likely that the people that you talk to on a regular basis will eventually begin to imitate the kind of conversational habits that you have. So this comes up all the time at work, right? Because we tend to think of our soft skills, the soft skills we hate talking about, as a waste of time. We see them as a distraction, or they're getting in the way of what we want to do, and our coworker keeps talking about our kid's dance recital, blah, 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 blah. But in fact, your conversations are a way to make your work better. They can make you better at what you do, both at work and at home. You know, one of the most powerful psychological and sociological tools that we have now is the MRI, the fMRI. Being able to scan a brain and watch it thinking while that person is still conscious has made us aware of all kinds of things that we didn't accept or weren't aware of before. So there's this great research that came out of Harvard in 2014. And what they discovered is that talking about yourself activates the exact same pleasure center in the brain as sex and heroin. It's inherently pleasurable, and not by a small amount. So I want you to think for just a moment about maybe the last time you had a job interview and you thought it went great, and then you didn't get called, or maybe a date, you went on a date and you're like, we totally clicked, that was fantastic, but you never got called back then. That's because your experience of that conversation might have been very different from theirs. It screws with our perception all the time. Now, at this point, it becomes a problem because one of the ways we have of fixing this communication problem is through face-to-face and voice-to-voice conversation. Human beings are evolutionarily, biologically, just universally designed beautifully to communicate face-to-face, or even through the voice, to detect nuances of changes in your voice, to detect body language and know what it is. You can walk into a room, right? And without anyone saying anything, you know if you're either at a funeral or a party. We don't give that very much credence, but that's huge. That's an incredible skill that human beings have that many other creatures don't have. The problem is that when you remove any kind of human interaction, either between looking at somebody's face or hearing their voice, right? How many of you would rather send an email than make a phone call? And be honest, because I know the statistics. Raise your hand if you'd rather send an email. Okay. It's gotten so bad at this point that there's big companies like Coke and JP Morgan Chase that have pretty much eliminated their voicemail systems. They don't even have it available anymore. So in the year 2000, Americans sent 14 billion texts per month in 2000. By 2010, 10 years later, it was 188 billion. And 4 years after that, it was 561 billion. We spend almost a half an hour every day, the average American adult, texting, and only 6 minutes on the phone. We don't actually know at this point what effect that growth has on our brains. The research lags so far behind because it takes so long to do a clinical study that we don't, at this point, know what effect the intrusion of social media and smartphones has on our human relationships and our brains. But I can tell you one thing. Empathy has declined by insane amounts. The University of Michigan did a survey that compiled the results of about 72 different studies. And what they found is that between over a course of 30 years, empathy declined by 40%. And almost all of that happened between, say, 2000 and 2011. So I get it, correlation is not causation, but it's kind of hard to not see a relationship between the rise in all this communication, digital communication, and the reduction in our own human empathy and relationships between each other. So I wanted to stay with empathy for just a moment because empathy is not one of those dreaded soft skills that we talk about. Empathy has a real purpose, and it's important. It has an evolutionary purpose. It has a sociological purpose and a societal purpose. And the loss of empathy is really troubling. It can cause us some real problems. And if you're looking around at the world, not just in the US where it's bad enough, but at Brexit and the migrant crisis and all those things going on in other places as well, you can see we need empathy in order to be able to get along with one another. The difference between empathy and sympathy is sympathy is when you say to somebody, you know, I feel bad for you. I feel for you. I'm sorry that happened to you. Empathy is when you say, I feel with you. I can understand what that's like. I can imagine what I would feel like if I were in that same situation. And it's a really, really crucial survival skill. So again, I'm at Google. I'm not talking about putting away your tech. I am not anti-tech. I wear a Fitbit. I've got a Surface tablet. I have pretty much every possible technology I could possibly get. My entire radio show is basically operated from Google Drive. Like, I am not anti-tech. But there are things that tech does really, really well. There are things that tech does better than human beings. And there are things that human beings do better than tech and will always do better than tech. And we need to learn to separate those two. We need to start being honest about what is an inherently human skill and what is an inherently technological skill, and then render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. And the biggest barrier of to conversation is that phone that all of you probably have, if not in your hands, then close enough. Let me tell you about this study. The average adult by this point checks, and this is research is a few years old, so it's probably more than this, but the average adult checks their phone about 110 times a day, and that's about once every 13 seconds. It peaks at about once every 6 seconds in the evenings, by the way. And the problem with that is that the phone is having effects on your brain that you're not actually aware of. So they did these studies in Britain in which they brought in a whole bunch of people, strangers, had never met each other, and they just had them have 5 to 10 minute conversations. In half of those conversations, they went in and they just placed a cell phone on the table. It didn't belong to either of the people. It did not make any noise. They just set it there on the table. And in those situations in which there was a cell phone sitting on the table, the pairs of people were something like 60 to 70% more likely to say the other person was unfriendly, untrustworthy, unempathetic, and unlikable. So I want you to think about how many times you sat down to have lunch with a friend or something, and you just set your phone on the table, but you felt really good about it because you didn't look at it. What you don't realize is that subconsciously your brain is aware of that phone. It's having an effect on the other person. It's also having an effect on you, because there's really great research on distraction. And what those studies show us is that even when your phone makes no noise at all, your brain is aware of it, and it's actually in fight or flight mode, prepared to respond should it make noise. Part of your brain power is occupied in paying attention to the email client that you have open in the background of your computer at all time. It's distracting you. You're just not aware of it. So, a lot of us get advice on conversation, and almost all of it is crap. We have heard, nod your head to show that you're listening, say maintain eye contact at all times. Believe me, I've tried it all out. It is terrible advice. Instead of learning how to pretend that you're paying attention, which is basically what nodding and saying is, it's way more authentic when you actually pay attention. So I want you to actually forget the advice you've had on small talk. There's no phrases that you can use. There's nothing that you need to avoid saying, except for things like, I'm not a racist, but avoid that. Other than that, there's no catchphrases to either use or not use that are going to help you, because it's all about you being who you are as an individual and recognizing that other person being who they are as an individual, and that's always going to be different. So I want to start with the 10 things that you can actually do to make your conversations better. And I would recommend that you choose one thing that you can do. Don't leave the room and be like, I'm going to be the best conversationalist ever. No, that's not going to happen. But choose one, and choose the easiest, the one that you think you can make that change without a lot of effort. So the first one is don't multitask. And you've probably already seen a lot of the research. Human beings can't multitask. It's not possible for our brains to focus on one thing at the same time that we're doing something else. But some of the other research shows there's a few things. The attempt to multitask, when you're trying to do multiple things, it pumps dopamine into your brain. It feels really, really good. But the other side of dopamine, you probably already know, is that you then crash. So if you have spent the day trying to multitask, you're going to go home at the end of the day more exhausted and feeling more fatigued than if you'd done one thing at a time. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the quality of your work of both tasks, say you're on a conference call but you're also answering email, quality of work for both things goes down by about 20%, and your IQ drops by 10 points. So I wouldn't do that. And certainly not in conversation. And I don't mean just putting your phone down. What I mean is being present in that moment. Being there in that conversation. Not trying to listen to somebody while you're thinking about a fight that you just had. And that's not always possible. It's not always possible to be present. And so therefore, if you can't be present, and it's not an urgent conversation, it's better to walk away. If you're not able to focus and pay attention, it's better to put that conversation off until there's a time when you can actually be there for the conversation, because otherwise you're basically wasting both of your time. The second thing is don't pontificate. Now, pontificate means to lecture. What I'm doing right now is pontificating, but we're not in a conversation. And this is another particularly difficult thing for smart people because we know a lot. And so people will start talking about something, and we'll start telling everybody everything that we know about that subject. That's not a good conversation. You should not go into a conversation trying to educate other people. I just believe me, my book goes into exactly all the reasons why, but it's going to turn that other person off, and they won't listen to you anyway. They will absorb almost nothing of what you say to them. So don't waste your time, right? Instead, just have a conversation and go enter into the conversation assuming that you have something to learn. It's best to just give up on going into a conversation trying to change anybody's mind or trying to educate anybody. This point is going to come up a little bit later, but you basically have to be quiet and just let people speak. I'm not actually worried that you have had people who said, well, if I do what you say, I'll never get to talk. Not actually worried about that. There's very few people in this world that I'm concerned about that would just stop talking. That's not a concern. But you're probably not listening as much as that you think that you are. But also, you're just missing out on a lot of things other people have to tell you. Just because someone is not educated or not, maybe even not smart doesn't mean they're not an expert in something. I mean, this is how Bill Nye says it. But what I always say, and one of the things that has been most surprising to me over my career in NPR is everybody is an expert in something. Everybody. There's something that high school dropout truck driver knows better than anybody else his area or her area of expertise. And if you go around with an effort to find what it is that makes someone else really an expert, you're going to be one of the smartest people on the planet. I mean, even Larry King says, you know, I'm not going to learn anything from what I say today. The only way I'm going to learn is by listening. And if all you're doing is walking around telling people what you know, you're not growing. You are learning nothing. So view everybody as a receptacle of information which is 100% unique to them. Some of it is probably crap. Some of it is wrong. But you know what? That's true of you too. Statistically, that's also true. So you can get through that and you can find real nuggets of information. Not always, but a lot of times. The third one is open-ended questions. And this is something that journalists use all the time to get better information and better interviews out of people. That means a question that starts with who, what, where, when, why, or how. And the formula for a young reporter is that if you put a complicated question in, you will get a simple answer out. And if you put a simple answer in, you'll get a complicated answer out. In other words, we often ask questions in which we're trying to steer their response, right? And you hear this from bad interviewers all the time. You know, you were in a hurricane and the winds were going blah, 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 120 miles an hour, and I guess you haven't even found your dog yet and your roof just peeled off. Oh my God, that must have been terrifying. The better thing is, the hurricane hit your house, you were still here. What happened? How did you feel? What did you hear? What happened to your dog? Why can't you find your dog? Let them take control at that point and tell you what happened. Let them have that moment because they were the one that was actually experiencing it. And this is really, really important with coworkers, especially if you're a manager. You need to let the other person actually describe what it is they're going through and try to resist the temptation to assume you know what they're about to say and interrupt them and then describe what it is that you think that they're saying. That's what leads to really bad communication. I was at the TED Summit last year in Banff, and this nuclear scientist from Japan comes up to me and he says, you know, I've watched your TED Talk like 3 times, and I still can't figure out how to start a conversation. And I said, well, where are you from in Japan? And he says, I'm from Kyoto. And I said, you know, I've never actually been there. Is that like Tokyo? Is it like all packed, really crowded? He goes, no, it's more spread out. You've seen the pictures of all the temples and the cherry blossoms. And I was like, so do most people have an apartment, or they have a house with an actual yard? And so he starts describing it, and about 5 or 10 minutes later, I said, that's how you start a conversation. You ask questions that they know the answer to about something they care about. That's it. And that's why small talk is so easy, and it's so rewarding for your brain, and your life expectancy gets longer if you actually talk to your neighbors and strangers on the subway. Your blood pressure goes down. Small talk that everyone thinks is not worth your time and you'd rather stare at your phone, small talk is really good for you. Really good for you, even if it's about nothing important like the weather or the most recent raise in gas prices. Even those totally meaningless conversations are great for you as a human being. And they have zero investment, right? You're not happy with it? You say, excuse me, and you go back to your cell phone, right? They say something offensive, you say, it's been nice talking to you, and you go back to your cell phone. Zero risk, no commitment. I highly recommend you just start talking to everybody that you can. Your Uber driver, whoever it is, just have these meaningless conversations. Believe me, if you're not happy or a month or 2 later, you can email me and complain. Full money back guarantee. Okay, the fourth one is go with the flow. So going with the flow means actually allowing the conversation to evolve and not inserting your own thoughts. So let's say someone says, well, let's meet at Starbucks later. And suddenly you remember that time you were at Starbucks and you saw Ellen DeGeneres and she admired your shirt or whatever. And so you stop listening to everything else they just said and you're just waiting for them to take a breath so you can tell your story about Ellen DeGeneres. That's what I want you to stop doing. You can't stop the thoughts from coming into your head. They're going to. But what you can do is let go of those thoughts and let them flow right out of your head and go back to what it was the other person was saying. Part of this occurs through mindfulness training, but it's just about not holding on to those ideas that come into your head and turning it into a self-promotional video. Besides, you've probably told the Ellen DeGeneres story too many times. Okay, number 5 is another big one that smart people have a problem with. And it's, if you don't know, just say that you don't know. I bet you can probably guess the profession, the number 1 profession that has the hardest time with this one. What profession do you think would have the hardest time saying, I don't know? Priests. It's a good guess, but actually it's surgeons. Surgeons can't seem to bring themselves to say, I don't know. And this has become a problem, right? Because they guess. So there have been studies done based in medical offices. And one of them in which they had their control group just continue on as they were doing. And this is with GPs. This one wasn't even with surgeons. And the other one, they said, every time you don't know an answer, just say, I don't know, but I'm going to find out. That's it. They just replaced their guesses with that phrase. And at the end of the study, the patients who had the second group liked their doctors better, their estimation of their intelligence went up significantly, their belief in their credibility and their knowledge went up significantly. And I realize it seems counterintuitive that saying I don't know makes people think you know more. But when you try to figure that out, it actually makes sense. Because the fact of the matter is we can't know everything. And so when you pretend to know everything, people know that some of it is BS. They just don't know which is BS and which isn't. So they're going to view everything you say with a grain of salt. And when I say you don't know, reading the first couple paragraphs or the preview that shows up in your Google search on a subject is not the same as knowing. You need to actually be an expert on a subject before you offer any unsolicited advice. Actually, forget that, don't offer unsolicited advice. But don't say you know something. Don't say a movie's great or terrible unless you've seen the movie. Don't base it off somebody else's review. Just say, I don't know. The 6th one is don't equate your experience with other people's. And this one is surprisingly, to me at least, the hardest one for people to accept. So if somebody says, I just lost my job, do not tell them about the time you lost your job 2 years ago. Or if someone's dog died, do not tell them about the time that you lost your dog. And I know this is difficult for people because we think that what we're doing is empathetic. And I say that because that's been my intention when I've done that, and I've done it plenty. And in the book I share a particularly still painful, like my cheeks still got hot when I think about that moment because it was so bad. You think that what you're saying to them is, oh, I've been through this. It's going to be okay. But you haven't been through it. You haven't. You've been through something that's kind of similar. But you're a different person in a different place with different resources. And even just as importantly, human beings, when they're comfortable, your accuracy, your empathetic accuracy goes into the toilet. So if you lost your job 2 years ago, but now you're okay, you are more likely to underestimate how much the other person is suffering. If you went through a divorce 3 years ago, and now it's 3 years later, and someone just found out they're going to get a divorce, you are more likely to think it's not that bad. Because our comfort makes us incapable of actually analyzing or estimating the other person's feelings. And so you're more likely to say things which are not good to say, like, it's going to be okay. Or, it's all right, everything happens for a reason. Or, who knows, this could be the universe closing a door and opening a window. Those are terrible things to say. They're not good. And the number 1 worst thing that you could say is, I know how you feel. Because you do not. You don't. It's just like the open-ended questions. You need to ask them. If they have come to you with a struggle or a pain, it means what they need right now is to be able to describe what they're going through. That's what they're there for. They're not there to hear about your experience that you had a couple years ago. And I know this is hard to let go to. I totally get it. But believe me, you're never going to say, gee, I really regret telling about myself in that particular moment. Like, that's never going to be a mistake unless they ask you, you went through a divorce 3 years ago. What lawyer did you use? How did that go for you? Then all bets are off. out of the gates, go ahead. Otherwise, let them talk. Number 7 is don't repeat yourself. So it's not only women, everybody does this. But women especially tend to repeat themselves. And part of the reason is we'll give instructions to someone, a kid or a husband or spouse or partner, and we don't get the acknowledgement of what we just said. And so we go about rephrasing it a bunch of times. Now, the other class of person that does this a lot is managers. Like you'll be in a meeting and they'll say, okay, so the deadline is 4 p.m. And then they'll go on talking. They'll say, now remember, if it doesn't get to us by 4 p.m., such and such terrible, dire thing is going to happen. And then later on, they rephrase it and rephrase it and rephrase it. Now, not only is that really boring, but the more importantly, right, because everything you say is really important, right? More importantly, you're training them not to listen to you. And this is especially true with children, but also spouses. They're not going to pay attention to you because they know you're going to repeat it. That's what you're training them to do. I'm going to say this again. So I would highly recommend that, especially if it's important information, you get people into the, do you think Colin Powell repeats himself when he tells people to do things? He does not. He says it once, and then you're culpable if it doesn't happen. And you deserve the same respect as Colin Powell. So just say it once. Don't bore people and don't train them not to listen to you. Just don't say it again. The first few times that happens with a kid, I can tell you from experience, it's painful. But especially if you make the stakes high, like I did, like I'm taking your car in to the shop, you're not going to have it for 3 days. And then he gets ready to go to work the next day and he's like, where's my car? And I'm like, I told you. I'm doing this thing where I only tell you once. Yeah, it can be painful, but it absolutely works. Okay, number 8 is stay out of the weeds. And by the weeds, when journalists say the weeds, they mean unnecessary details, things that people don't need to know. Now, this happens a lot with doctors and scientists and computer programmers and software engineers, that they just tell you details that are totally unnecessary. But it happens in your regular conversations all the time too, where someone will say, well, I'm going to Italy next year, and you'll say, oh my God, Italy is so great. I went there in like 2011. No, you know what? It was 2012 because Julie had just graduated. You know what? It wasn't. It had to have been 2013 because we just bought that Volvo, because the other one had gone, I mean, at that point they are gone and you will probably not get them back. That's it. Nobody cares about that stuff. Now, keeping track of those things is actually quite good for your own brain. So I highly recommend a journal or blog, but don't journal or blog all over other people. Just keep the details out of it. Now, this next one is the most important one. So this is the one we're going to spend the most time on, and it's listening. Now, I said that research shows us that we tend to overestimate our skills at conversation, and that's especially true of listening. But it's not really our fault. Human beings are just not designed to listen well. And even going back decades, back to the father of listening, Ralph Nichols, they showed that when if they made people listen to someone talking for like 10 minutes, and they would tell them, we're going to test you on this when it's done, so listen carefully. Immediately after that person stopped talking, people only retained 50% of what they heard. 48 hours later, it was down to 25%. And 3 months later, it was all gone. We do not retain information well. That's why Google's so successful as a search engine, right? We need something else to retain information and make it archivable. We don't do that, which means it requires training and effort and energy for us to actually listen in an engaged way. If you're not doing that, though, you're not actually having conversations. So, I mean, Buddha said, if my mouth is open, I'm not learning, right? I mean, there's so many incredibly smart people who've talked about just the crucialness of listening as a skill. I could spend the rest of the time just quoting them. But business people and academics have said it's one of the top 3 or 5, depending on which one you look at, most important skills you need for success in business. But in fact, if you look at business journals, 1.5% of the articles deal with listening. How many of you at some point were offered a public speaking course? Most of you? How many of you were offered a listening course? Right. So the thing of it is that we actually have to be trained in how to listen. There's this great research coming out of Australia and New Zealand in their school system there, in which what they discovered is that in order to improve your listening skills, you can't learn it through osmosis. You don't learn to listen during history class. You only learn to listen when somebody tells you, now we're going to learn how to listen better, and then you actually get training specifically in listening. And if anyone's had an infant, you know we're not born knowing how to listen. We're born knowing how to scream. We talk really well. We don't listen very well. And the reason I say this is because you're not going to leave this room and say like, oh, I'm going to be a great listener from now on. You are not. It's going to take discipline and practice, and sometimes you're not going to have the energy for it. And that's okay. It's okay to walk away at that point. I am not about more conversation. I'm about better conversations when you have them. So, I mean, one of the reasons that we don't listen is because we get distracted. And one of the reasons we get distracted is because the average person talks at about 150 words per minute. I'm from LA. I talk considerably faster than that. But we listen at up to 450 words per minute. So there's an extra 300 words in there that our brains are filling in. And we are inherently interesting to ourselves. So what we're thinking is sometimes more interesting than that the other person is saying. That's why like letting stuff go out of your brain is so important, because you have to be able to let those 300 words go by and still return to what that other person is saying. As Stephen Covey said, you know, most of us don't listen with the intent to understand, we listen with the intent to reply. And almost all of us do that. Worldwide, the amount of time between one person ending a sentence and the other person responding is less than half a second. Worldwide, which means nobody is actually listening to everything somebody has to say before they think about what it is they need to say next. And I highly recommend you get in the habit of taking a breath. Up that average. Take a breath to absorb what someone else has said and really think about it before you respond. Okay, the last one, number 10, is be brief. So you probably already know that our attention spans are shrinking. Microsoft has done incredible work on our attention spans. I don't know who the poor researcher was that had to watch the fish all day, but at this point, our attention spans, especially on the internet, is 8 seconds at a time before we're distracted, and that's 1 second less than that of a goldfish. We get distracted really easily. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It may not be. Who knows? Maybe evolutionarily, there's a real advantage to that. But I will say that if you talk for several minutes at a time without allowing the other person to respond, you're going to lose them. That's just the fact of the matter. I try to use a game of catch as an example of a good, healthy conversation. Because in a game of catch, if it's friendly and you're both trying to have fun, you cannot throw more times than you catch. It's an even split between the two. Not only that, you don't hold onto the ball for minutes at a time. You throw it back immediately. And you throw it in a way where you're trying to let them catch it. If it's a fun game, right, you're not pegging it off 500 yards. Well, 500 yards, nice throw, but you're not pegging it off the other way so they can't catch it. You're setting each other up for success, and you're sharing the space. When I gave a speech to ESPN, and now one of their CEOs keeps a ball on his desk at all times, just to remind him to let the other person talk. And I would say the same to you. The last thing I want to talk to you about is neural coupling. And this is also pretty recent research out of Princeton. So what they discovered, this just gets me all geeked out. So what they discovered is that when one person is telling a personal story, like in this case, they used a girl telling a story about a disastrous prom she had. And then they hooked them all up to fMRIs, and they let other people listen to her story. What they found was that when people were listening in an engaged way, their brains waves synced up almost exactly. In fact, so exactly that at times the listener would anticipate changes in the speaker's brain by a fraction of a second. Like they call it neural coupling, but it's mind meld, right? That's mind meld. It's amazing. Right? If Gene Roddenberry had written it in Star Trek, we'd be like, well, that's never going to happen. It's totally real. And this is what we give up when we text. This is what you give up when you use an emoji. This is inherently human. We're able to connect on a level that no emoji or digital device is ever going to be able to replicate. So keep your technology. Use your technology for all the things it does well, but reclaim this. Okay.
For my first question, when did you have the epiphany to start writing this book?
So that's really, you've read the book, so you already read, that's where the book starts, is that I was doing research for a story on flight safety. And part of my research, I read the transcript of the black box recording of a plane that went down outside of DC. And it was snowy. The pilot hadn't had a lot of experience with cold weather. He chose to take off before de-icing the plane, the engine, one more time. And they crashed within minutes, and just about everybody died. Only 2 people survived. But when you read the black box recording, the co-pilot repeatedly tries to say something's wrong. Keeps tapping the instrument saying, you know, that doesn't look right, blah, 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 blah. And the pilot says, no, it's all fine. And there was a lot of different developments that came out of that particular crash. We learned a lot from it. But one of the things that the FAA investigators thought was, well, we need to teach co-pilots how to be more assertive. And my thought was, why can't we teach pilots how to listen better? You know, I mean, granted, most of us aren't going to have a conversation where there's lives in the balance. But frankly, in hospitals, thousands of people die every year because of miscommunications in hospitals. That's just the truth. And those numbers are small because the only ones we're able to track are the ones in which there was a malpractice suit filed. So it's more than that. I mean, there are lives at stake over the fact that we can't communicate. And in the business world, I'm not trying to compare human life to money, but we lose trillions of dollars every year to miscommunication. A lot of it caused by email, frankly. Email is the devil when it comes to communication. There's very few things that email does better than a phone call. Very few. But that was sort of the epiphany for me, was like, we're looking at communication all wrong. It's not about the talker, it's about the listener.
So why do you think we focus so much time on becoming better communicators and not listeners?
Well, right, because like the cult of personality. I mean, when people are talking about Steve Jobs, they're talking about the guy standing in front of the screen and being so inspiring. And TED Talks, you know, somebody up there blowing your mind because they're such an incredible speaker. And we've also gotten to this place in social media where everyone's getting these personal brands and everyone has a blog. And you could argue that Facebook is kind of a living blog for everybody at all times. Like, it's always about creating your own identity, and we're trying to do it in a vacuum, right? We want to create our own identity without anybody getting in our way. And so we also want to stay in control. Like, we don't want to hear things that we don't like. We don't want to talk about stuff that we don't like. Like, we want to customize the human experience. We want to be able to unfriend people, like, as they're talking to us. Unfriend, go away. You know, we have created this reality in which we think we can avoid inconvenience and things that bother us. But the truth of it is that mess and that chaos is actually, that's the good stuff. I mean, that's the good stuff. You're gonna have to sift through some crap. But in the end, the true epiphanies and inspiration and imagination, that's going to come through that chaos, not outside of it.
So kind of like going through the suffering process, surviving it and enduring it.
The crucible of your character.
Now, does that connect to your other point about how you said younger generations are showing like an empathy gap?
Yeah. Well, you know, digital communication allows us to be the worst possible iteration of ourselves. They've done a lot of stories on our personalities in email, for example, and we tend to be less cooperative, we're more insulting, we're ruder, and we're less likely to negotiate an email. And there's other things too. For example, an apology that's written down has no effect on the brain. Like, in order for you to reach closure and forgiveness after a slight has occurred, there's a biological and neurological process that has to happen. And the first step of that is the compassion center, right? That other person has to have compassion for you before they can begin all that other stuff. So if you text someone or even email them, I'm sorry, nothing happens. it absolutely never touches the compassion center, which means that entire process of forgiveness and letting go never even begins. The thing of it is, the reason why we email and text instead of calling is because it's hard to apologize. It's difficult, and we'd rather avoid it if we could. But the fact of the matter is it's the struggle that actually makes the apology worth it. So the other person either hears us struggling to apologize, or they see us struggling, and suddenly, bing, the compassion center lights up. And that begins that whole thing. So it's basically useless to apologize over email. It's a complete waste of time. The other person may smile at you and pretend like they let it go, but the chances are it's going to stay there forever and ever. You'll never reach closure. So that's, when you talk about young people, that's not some kind of flaw in a young person's character. It's just that they're living in a world in which they've been able to avoid difficult conversations or outsource all of the pain of these interactions. And that has effects. And one of the effects is that they're not as empathetic. They're less likely to be empathetic than their parents and grandparents. Now, smartphone use at this point is so widespread. In fact, the UN, according to the UN, more people at this point have access to a cell phone than a working toilet. So that's not just a millennial problem. That's just a modern human being problem at this point.
You talked about the breakdown of communication between groups with different viewpoints. What do you think we can do to improve those lines of communication?
Well, we have to stop thinking that there's some people that you can't talk to. That's not a thing. And there's no such thing as somebody you have zero in common with also. If you think that, you're wrong. The problem is that we have to move out of our ideological bubbles. And I think that phrase has been used so much that it's kind of been vacated of meaning, but it's absolutely true. Pew has done some of the best research on this of anyone. And we are all living in ideological bubbles. White people especially tend to only have white friends. And if they do interact with somebody who is a person of color at work, that's not the person that they go home and interact with at home. Does that mean that people of color are going to have different political opinions with you? No, but they probably have a different experience than you do. And the research on diversity in terms of how much it helps us grow is just definitive, but there's also this incredible research on how much it helps us actually problem solve at work. So it's really fascinating. I get very geeked out by these numbers, but okay, so when you study people's solving problems, just the chance that you're going to bring somebody in the group that possibly has a different opinion makes everybody work better. The chance that there might be pushback and argument makes the quality of everybody's work go up. Just that opportunity. So when you're only surrounding yourself with people that you think are going to agree with you, you're not growing, you're not evolving.
It kind of ties into how we're cognitive misers and we like to be in comfortable situations. So how do we actively tell ourselves, like, how do you remind yourself about these 10 conversation tips? Do you have any cues that you use?
Well, it's easy for me because that's what I do all day, right? And not only that, but I have reminders constantly that I'm not the smart. I have zero illusions that I'm the smartest person in the world. Like, that's one of the best things about a TED conference, right? Like, there is no competition on my part to be the smartest person at a TED conference. Like, the pressure is off. But if I'm also if I'm interviewing some CDC person who's out risking her life in Africa to fight Ebola, my problems with my Galaxy phone pretty much pale in comparison. Like, it is very easy for me to keep myself in context and stay humble. If I'm talking to Salman Rushdie, I'm not the smartest person in the studio at that point. So it's very easy for me to do. But I think that for all of us, the most important thing is just to force yourself to start the conversations. That's it. Don't try to keep the rest of it in your mind at all. Just A, ask more questions, and B, just have the conversation. Force yourself to do it. Your Uber driver's there. My Uber driver had "I voted" stickers all over. And I was like, looks like you don't miss an election. And he went into this long description of how he got to America and the day that he got his citizenship and how frustrated he gets and blah, blah, blah. I didn't have to say a word. Like, again, pressure was off. I didn't have to say anything. I landed on something that he was incredibly proud of, and I just sat back and listened to his stories. And I would encourage everybody just to do the same thing. People are amazing. Can I swear? Even the shitty ones are amazing. They are. I mean, I'm a mixed race person. I've had plenty of conversations with sons of Confederate veterans and former KKK members. I've had conversations with people who I would find detestable in regular life. That's my job, is I'm the one that has to go and have those respectful conversations with those people. And you know what? I'm better for it. I am so much better for it. And they were good conversations. I learned stuff from those people. So I would just say, just have the conversation. They don't get money or any benefit from you listening to them. You're not helping them by listening. You're just having a human interaction with them. And you know, there's this guy named Daryl Davis. There's a PBS documentary about him. He's a jazz musician by night, but his hobby during the day is talking KKK members into leaving the group. And he's a black guy, by the way. He's so successful at it that he almost individually, alone, disabled the KKK operation in the state of Maryland by himself. And the way that he does that is he doesn't try to convince them not to be racists. He says, I just listen to them. And sometimes people just want to be heard. And I think just being heard, giving someone the gift of being heard, is one of the simplest, least expensive, best things you can possibly do, even if they're shitty.
You talked about the person who had the stickers in the back of their car. Are those kind of like conversation hooks?
Yeah, everything is a conversation hook, right? Like someone's going to wear a particular hat, or, I mean, you can find something that somebody has that they care about, you know, like your Fitbit. I can ask you about your Fitbit, you're going to explain. And you did, actually, when Ashley asked you about it, you said, well, I did, and you started talking about it. You ask questions they know the answer to about something they care about. It's really simple. There's always going to be something about that person. And if it's not, sometimes it's something that really annoys them. Like I asked somebody about their haircut, and she goes, oh my God, I had to get it chopped off because she ruined my hair, blah, blah, blah. But she was still talking. You know, I could still just sit back and listen to her rather than put in a huge amount of effort on my part.
Gave her validation, like
Exactly.
she's being heard.
She just wants to be, and remember the Harvard study. Don't forget the 2014 Harvard study. Talking about yourself gives you the same pleasure as sex and cocaine. Okay, so if you're giving someone the opportunity to talk about themselves, they're gonna feel great, right? You have, with very little effort, made them feel fantastic. It totally works with your boss.
So regarding that feeling of failure about not talking to somebody, how can people overcome that? Or there's
The fear of failure?
Yeah, like people don't want to reach out and say something because they want to say the best thing to this person and they don't know how to start a conversation. How do you overcome that fear of failure?
I don't actually know that. I would just say that the best thing to do is just try it. And if it doesn't go well, walk away. Say excuse me and walk off. I mean, I've done it a million times. I don't find an excuse. One of the biggest problems is that sometimes we try to explain why we're leaving a conversation. We're like, I have to go and we'll clean out my car. I dropped whatever. You know, you just say, oh, excuse me for a moment, and you walk off. It's very simple. If it's not going well, walk away and try it with someone else. You know, if you say something stupid, and I say stupid things all the time, just say, excuse me for a moment, and you walk off. And then you can moan about how dumb that thing was in private and start with somebody else.
That's excellent. Do we have any audience questions? We'll get you a mic in a second.
Ellison has a...
Thank you, Ellison.
Thank you so much for coming. Love the TED Talk, and this was great too. I'm already be brief because I haven't asked my question yet, but I'm going to ask you. So much great stuff. You mentioned the lack of empathy being a problem with, proliferation of cell phones, technology, and all that. I agree 100%. I'm wondering if you had any thoughts besides modeling, maybe, of how we can get, especially the younger generation, to maybe put down the phone once in a while and have a conversation.
So other than forcing them, which I can only do with my own kid, I don't actually know the answer to that. And it's a really big question. Like, I know that in my house, not even adults are allowed to bring their cell phones to the table. That's just a rule. And if you want to keep your cell phone, that's fine, but you're not eating. In my place, anyway. So you just kind of have to set limitations for yourself, and not in a jerky asshole way, but just like, this is how I do it. So, that's the way that goes. It's funny, and people are trying all kinds of different things. Chick-fil-A, the the chicken place. They now have this thing in a lot of the restaurants where there's a bucket in the middle of the table, and if you throw your cell phones in there and don't touch them, they'll give you a free ice cream at the end of your meal. And the ice creams are only $1.25, but if you multiply that by the number of people that eat at Chick-fil-A, that's a pretty huge investment in trying to encourage people to talk. I have no idea if it's going to work or not. But I think this is the moment right now when we have to start thinking about how do we do this. So, you know, cell phone addiction it's a thing. Like, it's a real problem. It's as bad, or if not worse, than gambling or food addiction. And especially if you're in tech, and you're a responsible tech person, this is something that should be on your mind. How do we make it so that tech does not ruin our humanity? I mean, that's kind of where we are right now. And mine is not the best mind to kind of think of that solution, but maybe yours is.
So you talked a lot about how kind of crummy email and text are.
Yeah.
At Google, we are in multiple countries, multiple offices, work with people all over the world. Are there tips and tricks for conversations that are perhaps not email, but phone or video conference? And are those better modes of...
Yes, video conferences are totally legit. Phone conversation is totally legit. And now, one of the things that email does well, remember I said it only does a few things well, one of them is that time lapse, handling time lapse. It also, it's one of the best ways to send an attachment, right? I mean, it's also the best way to recap a meeting or a phone call. So for example, if I have something where I need a nuance, or we need to sort of hash something out, I will always do that by phone. And I make people do it by phone. Like, they'll try to do it in email, and I'll say, I don't think this is the kind of thing we're going to be able to handle over email. Give me a time when you have 5 or 10 minutes on the phone, right? And then I will call them on the phone. And then when the phone conversation is done, then I send an email saying, here's what I heard. This is what we talked about. Is this what you heard also? That's where you can use email really, really productively. But to have any kind of discussion over email, every bit of research that we have shows the email makes it worse. It's a productivity killer. It's an innovation killer. It's much better to have it by phone. Now, a video conference, absolutely. Your phone call, absolutely. Absolutely. Remember, there's 3 parts to successful communication, right? There's the words that you use, the vocabulary, what they mean. Then there's your body language, and then there's your tone of voice. So there's a reason why we make jokes about sarcasm font, right? It's because if I say, maybe, that's really different than me going, maybe, right? One of them means no. And that is not translated through your printed word. This is why we have damn you autocorrect. This is why we have all those things making fun of how bad texting communication is. When you're emailing or texting, you're removing 2/3 of the meaning from what it is that you're saying. So it's not at all surprising that mixed communications happen all the time.
Hi. Thanks so much for coming. Super geeking out about everything that you are geeking out about. It's fantastic. Are you familiar with it? I'm sorry, I forget the speaker, but it's another TED Talk called The Power of Vulnerability.
Yes.
Does that sound familiar? So I'm curious about how that fits into what you're talking about, because it seems to be a thing that opens up good conversation, but is more about talking instead of listening.
Yes. Okay. So I think that is a great TED Talk, and wonderful, wonderful area of research. It's a little different than what I talk about. Related, but a little different. In my world, you show vulnerability by giving up control, by allowing someone else to share the platform with you. In a conversation, there's a thing called conversational narcissism, which is what most of us practice, including myself. I do not accept myself from that at all. But we're basically maintaining control of a conversation, and it allows us to keep the focus on ourselves and what we like to talk about. Now, if you're going to truly be vulnerable, that's when you hand over some of that control to someone else. The vulnerability is really essential, but in this particular case, it's not self-disclosure. Self-disclosure, you're already primed to do. Self-disclosure is just the scientific way of saying talking about yourself. And as I mentioned, it feels great. So I'm never really all that worried about people and self-disclosure. I'm worried about them allowing other people to self-disclose.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really enjoyed this talk, and I look forward to hearing more about what you're doing with your research and everything. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Thank you.